The morning light over Washington was a dull, heavy gray, one of those winter skies that felt more like a warning than weather. At 8:04 a. on January 20th, a black limousine sat motionless before the north portico of the White House. Its engine hummed softly, but the man inside didn't move. Dwight David Eisenhower, the hero of Europe, the general who had commanded millions, remained still, his hands folded, his eyes fixed forward, refusing to cross the 20 feet that separated him from the front door. Inside the White House, Harry Truman stood behind a window, watching. The glass reflected the lines around his eyes, lines carved by 8 years of war, Reconstruction, and the first icy winds of the Cold War. Behind him, the rooms were already half-packed, drawers emptied, photographs removed from walls. But Truman didn't turn around. He kept his gaze on the car that would not move. The temperature was 49 degrees. Just cold enough that breath fogged in the air, just warm enough that nothing felt sharp. Everything felt slow, weighted, reluctant. Even the Secret Service stood uneasily, aware that something unusual, something unmistakably personal, was unfolding in front of them. This was supposed to be one of the most solemn moments in American democracy. The peaceful transfer of power, the quiet walk through the door, the handshake, the ride to the Capitol. A ritual older than both men. A ritual bigger than either of them. But that morning, the ritual broke. Eisenhower would not step into Truman's White House. He would not have coffee with Harry and Bess. He would not follow tradition. He would sit in the car and wait. Outside, the flag over the White House hung limp in the still air, as if it too was holding its breath. It was easy for any passerby to imagine the scene inside the limousine. Mamie Eisenhower sitting upright, her gloves folded neatly in her lap, her silence polite but heavy. The general beside her, 62 years old, his jaw set in the same disciplined calm he had carried through Normandy, Ardennes, and the long march across Europe. Eisenhower had faced tyrants, marshaled nations, liberated millions, yet here he was, refusing to take a few steps into a house where a man he once admired was waiting. It did not look like politics. It looked like a wound. Across the driveway, Truman remained still. The man who had ordered the atomic bombs, who had rebuilt Europe through the Marshall Plan, who had confronted Stalin when Europe trembled. He looked, in that instant, less like a president and more like a man waiting for someone who wasn't coming. And maybe that was fitting. Because for Truman, this moment had been a long time coming. Years earlier, he had offered Eisenhower the presidency itself, twice. He had believed in him with a kind of uncomplicated faith, the way America often believes in its generals. He had imagined Eisenhower as the steady hand the country might one day need. But somewhere along the way, across conferences, wars, political storms, and one very public betrayal, that faith had hardened into something else. Resentment. Disappointment. A sense of having been misled. A sense that the man in that limousine had taken everything Truman had given him, then quietly turned his back when it mattered most. The sky brightened slightly, a pale strip of light cutting across the top of the portico. But it didn't warm the moment. This wasn't a scheduling issue. This wasn't confusion. This was deliberate. And everyone knew it. Even the head usher, J.B. West, watching from just inside the doorway, would later say he was grateful he wasn't in that car. The silence between the two men stretched across the driveway like a rope pulled tight. Somewhere in the distance, a Marine band practiced its opening notes for the inauguration. Reporters gathered on Pennsylvania Avenue, unaware that the transfer of power, the moment they assumed would be smooth and symbolic, was already cracked at its core. In the limousine, Eisenhower didn't glance toward the White House. Not once. His mind may have traveled back years, back to campaign stages where he had stood beside men who insulted George Marshall, back to words he had chosen not to speak when they mattered most, back to the cold political calculations that had cost him something deeper than votes. Inside, Truman may have remembered too, the letters, the praise, the partnership, the moment he told Eisenhower he would gladly step aside and run as vice president just to help him lead the country. Truman had offered him trust. Eisenhower had answered with silence. And now that silence had taken physical form. It sat in the driveway, behind the wheel of a government limousine. The moment asked a question that no one spoke aloud. How does a relationship built on respect fall apart so completely that two men cannot share a doorway? Truman finally stepped back from the window. A decision had to be made, and he knew it. He straightened his coat, adjusted his glasses, and breathed out slowly, a long, weary breath from a man who had carried more weight than the job was ever meant to demand. He would walk out. He would cross the cold stone steps. He would open the car door himself. Not because Eisenhower deserved it, but because the presidency did. And in that quiet, heavy walk toward the limousine, the world would see, not the pride of two men, but the fragile, enduring strength of American democracy. In the final months of World War II, the world was still burning when Harry S. Truman stepped suddenly into the presidency. It was April 12, 1945. Franklin Roosevelt had died at Warm Springs, and Truman, who had been vice president for only 82 days, was told he now carried the weight of a global war on his shoulders. Inside the Oval Office that evening, he admitted honestly, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now." He inherited a world on fire, battles raging across the Pacific, secret atomic research he had never been briefed on, and a post-war order that no one yet knew how to shape. In those early weeks, Truman's greatest need was simple: competence. He needed men he could trust, men who understood war, diplomacy, and the fragile balance between victory and chaos. And among all the towering figures of that era, one man stood out like a steady lighthouse through smoke: General Dwight David Eisenhower. Eisenhower was not a politician. He had no appetite for Washington debates, no interest in power for its own sake. He was a soldier molded by decades of discipline and shaped by the impossible responsibilities of commanding Allied forces in Europe. By the time Truman met him in Germany that summer, Eisenhower was already the face of victory, calm, steady, untouched by the ego that so often surrounds great commanders. Their first drive together through the shattered ruins of Berlin created a moment that would define their early relationship. The roads were lined with buildings cracked open like shells, staircases leading to nowhere, windows blown out by years of fire. Smoke still curled from distant rubble. Children watched silently from doorways. Truman, newly in office and still learning the enormity of what he had inherited, looked over at Eisenhower and saw not just a general, but the future. That day, Truman said something extraordinary, one of the most generous statements any president has made to any military leader. "General, there is nothing you may want that I won't try to help you get." He meant it. And Eisenhower felt it. For Truman, Eisenhower represented what America desperately needed in a world stumbling out of war: competence, moral authority, and a steadiness that seemed almost carved from stone. Truman even said, in private moments, that if Eisenhower wanted the White House itself, he would make it happen, even if it meant Truman stepping aside. That offer wasn't political. It was emotional. It was faith, simple, unguarded, almost naive. But Eisenhower declined. He said he was a soldier, not a politician. He said he wanted nothing from Truman but the chance to serve where needed. Truman believed him. A partnership of necessity, 1945 to 1948. In the years that followed, Truman and Eisenhower formed a working partnership built on mutual respect. It was not a friendship. Neither man was built for easy closeness, but it was a bond forged by circumstance and responsibility. Truman needed Eisenhower to stabilize a world rapidly sliding into a new conflict, the Cold War. Eisenhower needed Truman's trust as he transitioned from wartime command to peacetime strategy. In November 1945, Truman appointed Eisenhower as Army Chief of Staff. It was more than a title. It was a sign that Truman placed the future of the U.S. military and much of the nation's strategic destiny into Eisenhower's hands. The partnership deepened. 1945, Truman awarded Eisenhower the Distinguished Service Medal. 1948, Truman awarded him another. 1952, a third. 1951, Truman made Eisenhower the first Supreme Commander of NATO. Every time Truman honored Eisenhower, it was sincere, a reflection of admiration that bordered on affection. Newspapers routinely printed photographs of the two men standing side by side, smiling politely, their expressions formal but warm enough to suggest a working harmony. But beneath that harmony, something else lived quietly and unspoken. The seed of doubt. It began in 1947, quietly, subtly, almost invisibly. That summer, Truman wrote in his private diary about another conversation proposing that Eisenhower run for president as a Democrat, with Truman willingly stepping aside to become vice president. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a gesture. Truman meant every word. And Eisenhower again said no. Again, "I'm not a politician." Again, "I will not run." But this time, the refusal felt different. Truman sensed something he couldn't quite name. Something that didn't match the words. Eisenhower said he had no political ambitions, yet the public adored him. Congress admired him. Foreign leaders trusted him. Newspapers across America speculated openly about President Eisenhower. Truman knew Washington too well not to notice that sometimes a man says he does not want something, only because he has not yet decided how to reach for it. But he pushed the suspicion aside. He trusted Eisenhower. And he returned to the work of keeping Europe whole and the Cold War contained. The world changes, and so do men. 1948 to 1951. In 1948, Truman did what few believed possible. He won re-election in one of the greatest upsets in American political history. He won without Eisenhower's help. He won despite fractures in his party. He won while carrying the burdens of post-war reconstruction and the rising tensions of a Soviet confrontation. Eisenhower, during these years, moved in and out of military and diplomatic roles. He served briefly as president of Columbia University, then returned to service as NATO's commander, building the Western alliance that would define the Cold War's front lines. For a while, everything seemed steady. But in the background, American politics was shifting. Fear of Soviet spies, accusations of disloyalty, and the rising voice of a certain senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, began reshaping the country's moral climate. And into that storm, silently and without warning, walked a man both Truman and Eisenhower revered, General George C. Marshall. The attacks on Marshall would become the first crack that eventually split Truman and Eisenhower apart. But the deeper truth, the one that would shape everything that followed, was this. Their bond was never built on shared ambition, but on trust. And trust, once doubted, becomes fragile. As the 1950s began, the world was no longer the world of victory parades and liberated cities. It was a world of suspicion, ideology, and political knives sharpened in back rooms and smoky committee chambers. Truman looked to Eisenhower and saw the man he once wanted as president. Eisenhower looked to Truman and saw a leader at the end of a long, exhausting road. And in that space between what they once believed and what they now felt, the ground began to shift, quietly, almost silently, under their feet. Everything that would come later, the Milwaukee speech, the refusal to defend Marshall, the cold limousine on inauguration morning, had its roots in these early years, when admiration began to turn into doubt, and doubt began to turn into distance. Before the betrayal, before the anger, before the silence, there was a partnership built on hope. And hope, betrayed, is the deepest wound of all. By the early 1950s, the distance between Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, once almost invisible, had become wide enough for the entire nation to notice. But it did not happen suddenly. It was not one argument, not one disagreement, not one moment of lost temper. It was a slow unraveling, a long unwinding of trust, pulled thread by thread until the entire fabric gave way. And the thread that snapped first was named George Catlett Marshall. The attacks began. In the summer of 1950 and continuing into 1951, Senator Joseph McCarthy, lean, sharp-eyed, and fueled by the rising panic of anti-communist hysteria, began targeting Marshall with the ferocity of a man who needed an enemy more than he needed truth. Standing on the Senate floor, McCarthy unleashed a 60,000-word tirade that sounded less like a speech and more like a storm. He accused Marshall of losing China. He accused him of undermining American interests. He hinted, then practically shouted, that Marshall was aiding a communist conspiracy. These accusations were not just wild, they were grotesque. Marshall had built the army that defeated the Axis. Marshall had crafted the plan that rebuilt Europe. Marshall had served Presidents Roosevelt and Truman with absolute integrity. Winston Churchill called him the organizer of victory. History would call him the architect of Western stability. But McCarthy didn't need truth. He needed headlines, and Marshall was the perfect target. Soon, other voices joined in. Senator William Jenner of Indiana went further, calling Marshall a living lie and a front man for traitors. It was slander of the darkest kind. Truman's outrage. For Truman, these attacks were not just political, they were personal. Marshall was more than a colleague. He was an anchor of principle in a storm of international chaos. He had been Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. He had guided Truman through the most difficult decisions of his presidency. Truman often said Marshall was the greatest living American. So, when Marshall was attacked, Truman expected one man, above all others, to rise in his defense. Dwight Eisenhower. After all, Marshall had discovered Eisenhower. Marshall had promoted him, guided him, championed him. Marshall had given him the D-Day command, arguably the most consequential military role of the 20th century. Eisenhower was Marshall's protege. His success was Marshall's legacy. Surely, Truman thought, Eisenhower would speak. But Eisenhower was thinking of something else, the 1952 election. The decision to run. In early 1952, Eisenhower finally made the decision he had resisted for years. He would enter the presidential race, but as a Republican. It stunned Truman. For 5 years, Eisenhower had insisted he had no interest in politics. He had turned down Truman's offer to run as a Democrat, twice. He had said he wanted nothing to do with political machinery. But now, suddenly, he wanted the presidency after all. And worse, he wanted it in a way that required running against Truman's party. Against Truman's record. Against the post-war order Truman and Marshall had built. Still, Truman could have lived with political betrayal. Politics was rough. Men changed their minds. Alliances shifted. But what came next was something deeper, something moral. Milwaukee. The moment everything broke. In October 1952, Eisenhower traveled to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, McCarthy's home turf, to give a major campaign speech. His staff drafted a paragraph defending Marshall, a short but powerful acknowledgement of the man who had shaped his life. Reporters received the text in advance. The press prepared for a historic moment. Eisenhower, the war hero, would finally confront McCarthy's lies. Here is what the paragraph said. I know that charges of disloyalty have been leveled against General Marshall. I have been privileged for 35 years to know General Marshall personally. I know him as a man and as a soldier to be dedicated with singular selflessness and the profoundest patriotism to the service of America. It was dignified. It was true. It was long overdue. But hours before the speech, Republican advisors warned Eisenhower that Wisconsin was crucial. McCarthy was powerful. His supporters were loud. Defending Marshall, here, on McCarthy's own ground, might cost Eisenhower the state. Eisenhower hesitated. He thought of victory. He thought of the polls. He thought of what a single paragraph might cost. And then he made the choice. He deleted the paragraph. That night, he stepped onto the stage with McCarthy standing beside him. The crowd roared. Eisenhower raised his hand in greeting. When McCarthy approached for a handshake, Eisenhower tried to pull back, but the cameras were ready, and the senator grabbed his arm. The image that flashed across the country was devastating. Eisenhower, the hero of democracy, raising the hand of the man who had called George Marshall a traitor. The press erupted. Editorials poured in, condemning Eisenhower for cowardice. Even Republican newspapers criticized him. Truman was furious. He couldn't believe what he had seen. He told reporters, I never thought he would stoop so low. And he meant it. Indianapolis. The wound deepens. If Milwaukee cracked the relationship, Indianapolis shattered it. 2 weeks before Milwaukee, Eisenhower had campaigned with Senator William Jenner, the same man who had accused Marshall of joining hands with traitors. Eisenhower didn't defend Marshall. He didn't object. He simply smiled and accepted Jenner's endorsement. Later, Eisenhower would privately admit the event made him feel dirty. But he did it anyway. To Truman, this was worse than Milwaukee. There was no deleted paragraph here, no internal struggle. Eisenhower simply chose political safety over moral duty. Truman believed, and not without reason, that Eisenhower had abandoned Marshall for votes. The breach was complete. The campaign turns personal. What followed in the remaining weeks of the 1952 campaign was less a political contest and more a duel of wounded pride. Republican surrogates accused Truman's administration of corruption, incompetence, and softness toward communism. Eisenhower hinted he could end the Korean War, a suggestion Truman found insulting, even cruel. Truman responded with fire. He called Eisenhower a coward. He called him weak. He said he lacked the courage to stand up to McCarthy. It was ugly. It was emotional. It was personal. And it left scars that would not heal for years. The transition meeting. 2 men, 1 room, no common ground. On November 18, 1952, Eisenhower visited the White House for the traditional transition meeting. The Oval Office, usually a place of symbolic unity, felt tight, formal, almost hostile. Truman tried to brief Eisenhower about the staff, the cabinet, the daily schedule, the intelligence reports. He tried to pass along the wisdom of nearly 8 years in office. Eisenhower listened politely but impatiently. He felt Truman was lecturing him. He believed he already understood leadership. After all, he had commanded millions. Truman sensed the impatience. He walked away from the meeting, feeling that Eisenhower did not respect him. Eisenhower walked away, certain that Truman had nothing useful to offer. It was a failure on both sides. And it set the stage for the coldest inauguration day in American history. Not by weather, but by heart. The morning of January 20th, 1953. The limousine waited. The sky was heavy. The temperature hovered at 49 degrees. Eisenhower sat stiffly inside the car, refusing the traditional invitation to step into the White House. Truman watched from the window. He knew exactly what Eisenhower was doing. So did everyone else. And yet, because he was still President of the United States, Truman walked down those steps toward the waiting limousine. He opened the door himself. He climbed in. He sat beside the man who would replace him. Neither spoke. Neither looked at the other. It was a silence so cold, so complete, that even Mamie Eisenhower tried to break it with small talk about the weather and the crowds. Her voice faded into the stillness. Halfway down Pennsylvania Avenue, Eisenhower asked one question. Who had ordered his son John back from Korea to attend the inauguration? Truman answered simply, I did. Then he explained why. It was the right thing for a father, for a son, for a moment of history. Eisenhower said nothing. Not then. Not on that drive. It would take 10 years and the funeral of a fallen president before the silence between the two men finally cracked. War does not always involve gunfire. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, inside conference rooms, Senate chambers, campaign stages, and the private thoughts of men who carry the weight of nations. By the early 1950s, Truman, Eisenhower, and Marshall were no longer fighting on battlefields. But each man was still engaged in a different kind of war, a struggle for honor, loyalty, and moral clarity in an era darkened by fear. And it was in this quieter battlefield that their true characters emerged, sometimes noble, sometimes flawed, always unmistakably human. Before exploring Truman and Eisenhower, the story must return to the man at its center, George C. Marshall, the still point in a turning world. Marshall was not a charismatic figure. He did not seek attention. He did not write memoirs to explain himself. He never bragged, never complained, never defended himself publicly, even when others slandered him. His silence was his strength. But in a political climate driven by fear, that silence became a vulnerability. When McCarthy attacked him, Marshall did not respond. He believed that truth did not need defending, that honor spoke for itself. Truman admired this about him. It was the reason Truman once said Marshall possessed a strength of character that seemed carved from granite. To Truman, Marshall represented the best of America, duty over ego, service over ambition, honor over convenience. But this was also why Truman felt so deeply wounded when Eisenhower failed to defend Marshall. If a man like Marshall, who had given his life to the country, could not rely on loyalty, then what loyalty meant anything at all? In Marshall's quiet dignity, Truman found a moral compass. In Marshall's silence, Eisenhower found an impossible standard. And in Marshall's integrity, McCarthy found a target he could not understand. If Marshall was the mountain, calm and unmoving, Truman was the fire. Truman had many flaws. He was blunt. He was stubborn. He swore more than any president before or after him. He made mistakes and admitted most of them. But Truman possessed something rare in politics, utter loyalty. To Truman, loyalty was not sentimental. It was moral. When he believed in someone, he defended them with everything he had. He defended George Marshall not because Marshall was politically useful, but because Marshall had earned his trust. In the early 1950s, that loyalty came at a cost. He watched McCarthy and Jenner tear at Marshall's reputation like vultures circling a wounded giant. Truman fought back not with fear, but with fury. He called McCarthy a liar. He called Jenner a disgrace. He called Marshall the greatest living American, and he meant every word. But the deepest, most painful blow came not from McCarthy or Jenner. It came from the man who owed Marshall everything. Truman expected Eisenhower to step forward. He expected Eisenhower to say at least one line. General Marshall is a patriot. But Eisenhower said nothing. And that silence broke something inside Truman. A break far deeper than politics, deeper than party, deeper than pride. Truman was a man who believed that character mattered more than ambition. So when Eisenhower chose ambition, Truman felt not anger at first, but heartbreak. It was a moment when the world learned who Truman truly was, a man who placed loyalty above victory, a man who placed principle above popularity, a man who believed that in the name of honor, some fights must be fought even if they are lonely. Eisenhower is perhaps the most complicated figure in this story, not because he lacked integrity, but because he lived inside a battlefield of competing obligations. On the one hand, Eisenhower was deeply loyal to George Marshall. Marshall had found him, lifted him, shaped him, believed in him. Eisenhower never forgot that. But Eisenhower also believed he had a greater duty, to win the presidency and lead the country at a moment of global danger. He believed he could end the Korean War. He believed he could bring stability to a divided America. He believed he could manage the Cold War more skillfully than Truman. And so, when his advisors pleaded with him to avoid antagonizing McCarthy, especially in swing states like Wisconsin and Indiana, Eisenhower listened. He did not betray Marshall out of malice. He did not despise Truman. He was not a coward at heart. But he was calculating. And he believed that the long-term good he could do as president outweighed the short-term pain of silence. This was Eisenhower's greatest moral conflict. Protect the honor of one man, or secure the leadership of a nation? To him, the answer seemed clear in the moment. But history would not be so forgiving. The Milwaukee speech was the turning point. Eisenhower had every intention of defending Marshall. He approved the paragraph. He knew it mattered. But when the political pressure mounted, he folded. This was Eisenhower's flaw, not lack of courage, but an excess of calculation. He believed he could make it right later. He believed Marshall would understand. He believed Truman's anger was just part of politics. But some choices cannot be undone. Some silences speak louder than words. And in that moment of silence, Eisenhower revealed a truth about himself that Truman never forgot. Eisenhower was a soldier of extraordinary discipline. But in politics, he was still learning what a battlefield of conscience looked like. The scene inside the limousine on January 20th, 1953, remains one of the most human and heartbreaking moments between two American presidents. Truman sat beside Eisenhower. Two men who had once admired each other, now unable to speak. For Truman, the silence was filled with memories. The day he told Eisenhower he would give him anything, including the presidency itself. The trust he placed in him. The hope that Eisenhower would join him in defending Marshall. The pain he felt when Eisenhower didn't. The shock of watching Eisenhower shake McCarthy's hand. For Eisenhower, the silence was heavy with his own thoughts. He knew Truman felt betrayed. He knew his silence about Marshall had hurt deep. He knew the campaign had become too personal, too bitter. And he knew that walking into the White House that morning might feel like submitting to a man who had insulted him repeatedly. Both men were proud. Both men were wounded. Both men felt justified. Both men were human. When Eisenhower asked who had ordered his son John home from Korea, Truman answered simply, "I did." No anger. No sarcasm. No political undertone. Just a father doing what he believed was right for another father. In that moment, the humanity inside Truman flickered through the bitterness. The humanity inside Eisenhower flickered too. He simply didn't know how to show it. The silence that followed was not coldness. It was exhaustion. Two men who had given everything to their country were now too tired, too bruised, too proud to say what they truly felt. Behind every public action was a private fear. Truman feared that Eisenhower's silence would empower men like McCarthy, that America might forget the principles Marshall stood for, and that loyalty no longer mattered in public life. Eisenhower feared that confronting McCarthy would divide his party, cost him the election, and weaken the country. That Truman's attacks had painted him into a corner where any gesture of respect looked like surrender. That one wrong move could doom his presidency before it began. Marshall feared nothing for himself, only for the nation. Marshall once told a colleague, If future generations look back on these years and see chaos, then all we built was fragile. Marshall worried that political fear, not foreign enemies, could unravel the country from within. In a way, he was right. Each man made a choice that revealed his essence. Marshall chose silence because he believed honor did not require defense. Truman chose loyalty because he believed character was worth fighting for. Eisenhower chose victory because he believed the country needed him in the White House above all else. None of them were entirely right. None of them were entirely wrong. But their choices collided in a moment that history would never forget, a moment that felt like a wound carved into the very steps of the White House. History rarely moves because of one single moment. It drifts, bends, and shifts under the weight of choices made by men who often never see the ripples they create. But sometimes, once in a generation, there is a moment so symbolic, so revealing, that it becomes more than an anecdote. It becomes a lens through which the entire era can be understood. For Truman and Eisenhower, that moment was the morning of January 20th, 1953. But the consequences of that moment, its meaning for America, for the world, and for their legacies, would stretch far beyond the cold silence inside that limousine. When Eisenhower took the oath of office at the Capitol, he spoke with the calm authority that had carried him through wartime command. His words were measured, confident, and touched with the solemn hope Americans expected from him. But if the public ceremony seemed warm, the private reality was still frozen. Truman left the Capitol quickly, without lingering for the parade. He went straight to Union Station, greeted by thousands who cheered him like an old friend returning home. The applause that echoed inside the station felt more human, more sincere, than anything he had experienced during the last months of political fighting. Eisenhower returned to the White House, a house he now refused to associate with Truman in any ceremonial way. And for the next 8 years, Truman never stepped inside it again. The freeze had become official. Eisenhower entered office with the calm confidence of a man who understood long-term strategy better than short-term emotion. He approached the presidency the way he approached war, with careful planning, steady patience, and an instinct for avoiding rash emotional decisions. He achieved things Truman had hoped for but could not complete. And he ended the Korean War through a combination of diplomacy and a willingness to use credible force. He strengthened NATO, shaping it into a durable alliance that would outlast both men. That he launched the interstate highway system, a domestic project as transformative as any 20th century American initiative. He maintained stability through the early, tense years of the Cold War, an era when a single misstep could have led the world toward nuclear catastrophe. In many ways, Eisenhower governed exactly as Truman had once hoped he would. But the wound between them remained. Truman respected Eisenhower's administration from a distance, though often with frustration. Eisenhower, for his part, tried to maintain a polite distance without engaging in any genuine reconciliation. The irony was unmistakable. Two men who shared the same goals for America, strength, stability, dignity, could barely speak to each other. After returning to Independence, Missouri, Truman lived a simple life. He took daily walks, often greeting neighbors by name. He donated his papers to create the Truman Library. He wrote his memoirs with characteristic bluntness. He gave occasional speeches that mixed humor, regret, and a deep love for American democracy. But the bitterness toward Eisenhower lingered. He once said he could hardly mention Eisenhower's name without cursing. He felt the invitations sent by Eisenhower to return to Washington were insincere. He rejected them all. Yet privately, Truman understood something deeper. He and Eisenhower had been victims of a political moment more than each other. The Cold War had forced every American leader into impossible choices. Ambition had collided with loyalty. Fear had collided with the principle. Good men had been forced into positions no one envied. Still, the silence held. To the world beyond America's borders, the Truman-Eisenhower rift was not merely personal. It reflected something larger and more unsettling, the moral anxiety of the early Cold War. To America's allies, the fracture hinted at instability. If the United States was divided internally, could it truly lead the free world? To America's rivals, it suggested opportunity. The Soviets watched the McCarthy era closely, viewing the internal accusations and political fear as signs of American vulnerability. To ordinary Americans, it felt like something sacred had been broken. The peaceful transfer of power was supposed to symbolize unity, dignity, and continuity. But Eisenhower's refusal to enter the White House revealed how personal anger could overshadow even the most important civic rituals. Yet, through all of this, the nation did not fracture. The institutions held. The government moved forward. Democracy proved stronger than the bitterness of its leaders. And that too carried its own meaning. For almost 11 years, Truman and Eisenhower remained locked in a kind of symbolic exile from each other. They attended funerals, stood in the same rooms, exchanged brief nods, but nothing more. This silence had its own cost. Two of the most experienced leaders of their generation, each shaped by war, each carrying hard-earned wisdom about the world, could have collaborated during moments of Cold War danger. Instead, they maintained a distance that helped no one and healed nothing. The country lost something in their separation. So did history. It took a national tragedy to bring them back together. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, the country fell into a grief deeper than anything since FDR's death. World leaders gathered in Washington. Former presidents were called to stand together in mourning. Truman and Eisenhower rode in the same car to Arlington National Cemetery. For the first time in a decade, they spoke. Not about the campaign. Not about Marshall. Not about who was right or wrong. They spoke about the tragedy, about the world, about shared memories of leadership. Two old men remembering the weight they had once carried. At Blair House afterward, over sandwiches and coffee, the conversation continued. Witnesses later described it as gentle, warm, nostalgic, as if the bitterness had evaporated, leaving only the bond of two men who had known the burden of responsibility better than almost anyone alive. When they stood to say goodbye, they shook hands for a long moment, an unspoken recognition that life was too short and pride too fragile to justify another decade of silence. It was not just reconciliation. It was release. Eisenhower lived until 1969. Truman until 1900. Each man spent his final years surrounded by family, honored by the public, revered by historians. With time, the bitterness diminished. What remained were the larger truths of their lives. Truman, blunt but decent, fiercely loyal, underestimated but strong. Eisenhower, disciplined, calculating, steady, a guardian of peace in a dangerous world. Marshall, the silent architect of victory and peace, the moral center whose integrity shaped the century. Their story became one of those uniquely American tales, part tragedy, part lesson, part reflection of the nation's own internal conflicts. The Eisenhower-Truman rift reveals something essential about the United States during the mid-20th century. Even great nations depend on fragile human relationships. Democracy is not just institutions, it is character, humility, and the willingness to put duty above pride. The refusal to enter the White House was not about tradition. It was about wounded honor. But Truman's decision to walk out anyway showed something even more important, that democracy must survive even when people fail. America, in that moment, rose above the disappointment of two flawed men. Looking back now, the story offers lessons that feel timeless. Loyalty matters. Not the loyalty of politics, but the loyalty of character, standing up for what is right, even when it costs you. Silence can wound as deeply as words. Eisenhower's refusal to defend Marshall hurt Truman more than any speech could. Pride is powerful, but forgiveness is stronger. It took 10 years, but in the end, both men chose grace over resentment. Leadership is not just accomplishment, it is moral courage. And moral courage sometimes means defending someone who cannot defend themselves. In the end, history remembers the people who tried to do the right thing. And it remembers the cost of not doing it. What makes this story resonate so deeply with Americans, especially older Americans who lived through the era, is not the politics. It's the humanity. Two men who carried the fears of a world at war. Two men who loved their country in different ways. Two men who wanted to do right, but stumbled, in different moments, in very different ways. Their failures were human. Their reconciliation was human. And their story reminds us that even the strongest leaders are shaped not just by victories, but by regrets. In the end, history remembers the morning of January 20th, 1953. Not because of speeches or ceremonies, not because of the weather or the crowds, but because of a silence. A silence between two men sitting side by side in the back of a limousine. That image, stark and strangely intimate, has outlived the politics of its day. A general staring out a window. a president staring straight ahead. Two men who had once admired each other, now unable to speak a single word, as the wheels carried them toward the Capitol and into the pages of history. There were no shouts, no accusations, no dramatic confrontation. Just silence. And sometimes, silence is the loudest sound of all. It echoed through the White House for years after Truman left it. It echoed through Eisenhower's presidency, and the invitations Truman declined, and the memories both men carried. It echoed through the nation, a reminder that even giants can falter, even leaders can wound each other, even the strongest institutions depend on fragile human hearts. But the story does not end in bitterness. 10 years later, two older men, slower now, softer around the eyes, humbled by time, sat together again, this time in grief for a fallen president. They spoke easily, gently, like men remembering not the wounds, but the weight they once shared. Something had changed. Not the past was immovable. But the men themselves. Eisenhower no longer carried the pressure of office. Truman no longer carried the sting of political betrayal. They were simply two veterans of history, men who had survived storms few could imagine, finally able to see each other without the shadows of pride and anger. The handshake outside Blair House after Kennedy's funeral was long, quiet, almost reverent. It was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was something more subtle, more human, an acknowledgement that time had taught them what power never could. That pride fades. That anger wastes years. That friendship, however fragile, however wounded, is a better ending than silence. They would meet once more in 1966, sharing a table, laughing softly. Witnesses said it felt as if all the old bitterness had melted away. And perhaps that is the true meaning of their story. Not the conflict, not the campaigns, not the limousine, but the simple, quiet truth that healing, though slow, though difficult, is possible. Even for presidents. Even for proud men. Even for the wounded heart of American politics. Their lives remind us that leadership is not only about victories or doctrines or historic accomplishments. It is about the people who walk beside us, believe in us, disappoint us, hurt us, and sometimes find their way back to us again. It is about humility. It is about forgiveness. It is about understanding that the legacy of a great nation is built not just on power, but on character. And so, when we look back on Truman and Eisenhower today, we do not see enemies. We see two men who loved their country with equal fervor, but different temperaments. Two men who stumbled, learned, aged, softened. Two men who carried the weight of the world during its most dangerous decades, and who, in the twilight of their lives, rediscovered the humanity that had once bound them. The limousine moment was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of their lesson. A lesson about pride. A lesson about silence. A lesson about the fragile dignity of democracy. And ultimately, a lesson about grace. History will always remember the tension between them. But it will also remember the moments, years later, when that tension finally broke, and two old soldiers found peace. And now, as America faces its own era of division and doubt, the story of Truman and Eisenhower feels achingly familiar. The anger. The mistrust. The sense that political opponents are enemies rather than partners in a shared experiment of freedom. But their story offers something rare in today's climate: hope. Hope that even deep wounds can heal. Hope that pride can give way to humility. Hope that time can illuminate what anger once obscured. Hope that leaders, even flawed ones, can grow wiser with years. Their final handshake reminds us that the United States has endured not because its leaders were perfect, but because they eventually rediscovered what truly matters: dignity, decency, honesty, forgiveness, responsibility, and above all, the courage to put the country above the self. As you reflect on their story, consider this. If two men separated by war, politics, pride, and betrayal could find their way back to respect, then what might be possible for us today? If their silence in that limousine symbolized the cost of division, then their handshake at Blair House symbolized the power of reconciliation. Perhaps that is the moment we should carry forward. The moment when anger gave way to memory. When rivalry gave way to understanding. When two old presidents finally looked at each other and saw not opponents, but equals. And if their story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about leadership, history, or America itself, then share it. Share it with your friends. Share it with your family. Share it with those who still believe that history has lessons worth hearing. Because stories like this are not just about the past. They are warnings. They are reminders. They are guideposts. And sometimes they are second chances. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more forgotten battles, hidden histories, and untold soldier stories to life. And let me know your thoughts in the comments. What event or perspective would you like to see next? I read every comment.